Prince. The music icon died on April 21st at his Paisley Park complex in Chanhassen. An autopsy was performed soon after the body was discovered, and since then, an investigation has been underway to determine the exact cause of death. The Midwest Medical Examiner's Office, based in Anoka County, is leading that investigation. Joining me now with more on what we can expect to hear and not hear is the Chief Medical Examiner for Hennepin County, Dr. Andrew Baker. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
This is obviously a high-profile case. How much of the autopsy and toxicology reports will be made public?
Under Minnesota law, specifically Statute 13.83, there are only certain things the medical examiner can release to the public, and there are many things the medical examiner cannot release to the public. What the public can expect would be the cause of death and the manner of death, and a variety of other basic demographic information. But specific things such as the autopsy report or precise toxicology results are generally non-public data under Minnesota law.
And who then has to go to court to release all the information?
Depending on how the death is classified by the medical examiner, the family and the treating physician of the decedent have legal access to the non-public data in the medical examiner's file. Anyone else in the public would actually have to petition a court to get access to things that are classified as non-public under the law. And normally that protection exists for 30 years under the statute.
A lot of attention will be paid to the toxicology information related to Prince's case. How difficult is it to determine whether drugs led to someone's death?
It really depends on the nature of the drugs that you find, how much of the drugs you find in the person's system, and then you have to correlate that with the person's known medical history. There's drugs that are dangerous at almost any level in a person's system, and those become fairly easy to interpret. Many of the things that people take for medicinal reasons, specifically opiates, there's a great deal of art involved in the interpretation of the post-mortem levels because you need to know how much the person was taking, how long they've been taking it, so you have some idea as to how tolerant of the medication they were.
Is there a standard for what constitutes a lethal dose of a drug when determining the level of a drug in the deceased's system?
For some drugs, almost any level in the system can be lethal under the wrong circumstances. The best example of that would be cocaine, which is really never safe. But when we're talking about opiates, which are much more common nowadays, there is no specific number you can point to and say above that level, this would be fatal for anyone. That level always has to be interpreted in the context of the person's medical history. What might be a perfectly normal level for a chronic pain patient or somebody with metastatic cancer who's taking high-dose opiates, that level could be lethal to someone who is what we would call opiate naive, who has not had opiates anytime recently.
I know that after the body ceases function after death, a lot of processes take over, and that includes the migration of drugs in the body. Is that problematic in determining death by overdose?
That can be problematic. Again, it depends on the nature of the drug you're looking for and how long the person has been deceased before you collect the specimen. There are certainly some best practices people can use, like drawing the right specimen from the right location at the earliest time you can. It does make the numbers a little easier to interpret. But yes, there are changes after death that are yet another factor in trying to interpret these numbers.
Can organs show signs that someone died of an opioid overdose?
There are certainly what we would call soft autopsy signs that somebody died of an opiate overdose. Those would include things like very wet, heavy, congested lungs, foam in the airway, retention of a large amount of urine in the bladder. But again, these are very soft signs. They're not diagnostic of an opiate overdose. They simply suggest it. Really, there's no long-term specific organ pathology that's going to indicate that someone died of an opiate overdose.
Someone a long time ago, a medical examiner that I interviewed many years ago, said you can die from a drug and you can die with a drug. Does that make sense to you, to hear that?
That makes complete sense, and that really gets to the crux of the issue. Many people that we perform autopsies on that we did specifically because we were worried about an opiate overdose also have very significant underlying natural diseases, heart disease, emphysema, metastatic cancer, you name it. And then interpreting those levels becomes even more difficult because we have what would be called a, quote, competing cause of death, unquote. When you find a high level of opiates in a 25-year-old with absolutely no underlying natural diseases, the interpretation of those findings is considerably easier than a 50-something who has